Hello, welcome to the training on the Sexual Assault Services Formula Grant Program Annual Progress Reporting Form. This training is intended for SASP Formula administrators. Thank you for accessing our recording. We hope that this training enables you to provide the most detailed and accurate reporting of your grant-funded work and of the grant-funded work your subgrantees are doing. The goals for this recording are to help you to understand the overall reporting process, to help improve your understanding of how to respond to questions on the SASP Administrator Annual Progress Reporting Form, to learn tips and best practices for reviewing SASP SubGrantee reports, and to help learn about the available resources and guides for SASP administrators. For SASP Formula, administrators are required to fill out a separate reporting form for each federal fiscal year, or FFY, from which funds were awarded to subgrantees or returned by subgrantees during the reporting period. If you are a SASP Formula administrator who is also a STOP administrator, you will notice that on the STOP administrator form, you can list funds from more than one FFY. That is a key difference between the STOP Formula form and this SASP Formula form. Note that the reporting period for the SASP Administrator Reporting Form is of a 12-month calendar year from January to December. On the Administrator form for the SASP Formula Program Grant, in question 1, you will put the date of the report. In question 2, you will put the reporting period year. In question 3, you will put the grant number. In question 4, you will put the SASP administrator's name. In question 5, you will put the agency's name for which the SASP administrator is at. In question 6, you'll put the address for the agency at which the SASP administrator is located, along with the contact information for the SASP administrator. In question 7, report the FFY or federal fiscal year and grant number that you are reporting on in the first column, and then report the amount of SASP program funds awarded to subgrantees and amounts of funds returned during the current reporting period. Note that in question 7, do not report on the amounts awarded or amounts returned unused during previous reporting periods. In question 8A, you are still reporting on the same FFY as in question 7. In the second box, the amount of the SASP grant for the FFY will be pre-populated for you. And in the final box, the percentage used for administrative costs will be automatically calculated. In the third and fourth boxes, report the amount spent on administrative costs during the current reporting period and the amount spent on administrative costs in all previous reporting periods. For those of you who used funds from a single FFY grant to cover administrative costs in more than one reporting period, here is an example of how you would report in question 8A. In 2018, for example, let's say that I used $10,000 from FFY 2016 funds to cover administrative costs. I would enter $10,000 in the first column, and that's what I used in the current reporting period. In 2017, let's say that I used $15,000 of FF 2016 funds to cover administrative costs. Then I'm going to enter the $15,000 in the fourth column because that is the amount of the federal fiscal year 2016 funds that I used in the previous reporting period. The form will add those two together and divide by the total amount of the federal fiscal year 2016 award, which will be what populates the final column, the percentages used for administrative costs. If you reported any funds used for administrative costs in question 8A, please provide a detailed description of the amount and the type of cost in the narrative question 8B. Please note, if you give administrative funds to your coalition for administration and not services, the amount should still be reported here. Coalitions do not fill out a subgrantee form for administrative funds. For question 9, report the list of subgrantees that you awarded funds to as an attachment in Appendix A. The next section of the SASP administrative form is the narrative section. There are required narrative questions in this section. Question 10, underserved population, is required, as is question 11, staff funding and other funding, and question 12, remaining areas of need. These are required on each reporting form. Please do not use acronyms when you write your narrative information. Additionally, the narrative sections on the form are not set up to accept formatted writing, so do not use bullets or formatted styles of that sort. Narrative questions 13, 14, and 15 are optional, but we encourage you to use these narrative questions to provide further information about your SASP subgrantees and their funded activities. In question 13, talk about the changes that have occurred in your state or territory due to SASP funding. What is your state able to do now that it was not able to do before? In question 14, talk about the standout programs and promising practices being supported by SASP funds in your state. We often use quotes from this question when we write the biennial report to Congress at VAWA MEI. In question 15, you can provide any information about the data in this report that you think we should know about. This is the first place we will look if we have any questions about your data before we contact you. Now we will go over tips and best practices for reviewing the SASP subgrantee report. We will review the reporting process, and finally we will learn about what available resources there are for guides for SASP administrators and for subgrantees. Why does subgrantee data matter? First, the subgrantee report provides you with an opportunity to communicate directly to OVW and to help share your subgrantees' success stories with Congress and the general public. When you are reading through your subgrantees' reports, think about if they successfully convey how this funding has made a difference in how they do their work. For example, how has the funding impacted the state? Are the subgrantees meeting on a regular basis to identify and resolve barriers to effective practice? Most importantly, how has this funding made a difference to the people your subgrantees serve? Once you submit your administrator report and the subgrantee report, it is our role at VAWA Measuring Effectiveness Initiative to review the data and the narrative in order to generate reports that are presented to Congress on the effectiveness of OVW programs. Again, this is a way to communicate with Congress and decision makers. It is important that the data tells an accurate story, and that is why we spend so much time on making sure the data are correct across programs, and specifically so everyone is reporting the numbers in the same way. The SASP report to Congress has a few different parts. Part 1 includes what allocations and distributions of SASP program funds there are. In Part 2, there's the effectiveness of SASP program in general. Part 3 goes over SASP aggregate accomplishments, and the appendices include state-by-state allocations, victims served, and demographics by state. There is an overview of the reporting cycle. SASP subgrantees will submit their form to administrators electronically. Please ask your subgrantees to validate their forms. That will save you and us a lot of work later. You are responsible for reviewing the reports they submit before you submit them to VAWA MEI. Please do not send VAWA MEI forms that have been filled out by hand or scanned. OVW expects SASP administrators to review forms and support grantees who need assistance with filling out the electronic form. Please do not send VAWA MEI other forms that your state subgrantees have filled out that are not the subgrantee form. OVW expects all subgrantee forms and state administrator forms to be used as applicable. This is important because all forms and data are aggregated and must be in the correct fillable electronic form in order to be aggregated and analyzed. Please note that each subgrantee should submit only one annual report per calendar year to their administrator with an unduplicated number of victims served for the entire year. Staff should reflect the number of FTEs for the entire year. We know that some administrators ask their subgrantees to provide more frequent reports, but it is expected by OVW that only one final report per subgrantee is submitted to VAWA MEI, which should reflect the grant-funded activities for the entire calendar year. Now we will go over the SASP subgrantee form, starting with Section A1, General Information. Note that throughout the form, if you or your subgrantees need more clarification about a specific question, you can click on the question mark icon and more instructions and/or examples will pop up. In question 1, the subgrantee will enter the date of the report. In question 2, the subgrantee will enter the current reporting period. In question 3, the subgrantee will enter the subgrantee agency's name. In question 4, the subgrantee will enter the subgrant numbers. Every subgrant that was used during the calendar year is reported here. As another quick reminder, only one form per subgrantee should be submitted, so they should report on all different grant numbers that they received or used during the calendar year in question 4. In question 5, the subgrantee will enter the type of funded organization. Note that if the subgrantee is a sexual assault coalition that is passing money through to local programs, the local programs should be filling out the subgrantee form and prorating their FTEs, victims served, and other activities to reflect only what was done with SASP program funds. Question 5A and question 5B are yes or no questions. In question 6, the subgrantee will enter the point of contact for their agency. This should be the person who is responsible for the day-to-day grant-funded activities so that if there are any questions about their data, we are able to go back and ask them. In question 7, if the subgrantee specifically focuses on serving tribal populations, then the grantee should list out the specific tribes and nations that the agency is aiming to serve. Next, we will go over Section A2, Staff Information, of the SASP Program Subgrantee Form. We do have some tips for administrators who are reviewing staff sections. You should check that staff have been reported by activity performed or job function rather than by job title. This is because we know that many staff perform many different functions that can fall into multiple categories, and we want to make sure that all of that is captured. Staff FTEs should be prorated for the 12-month reporting period. If SASP funds did not directly support staff, FTEs may be calculated with organization staff using the percentage of overall budget that the SASP grant comprises for that subgrantee agency. Make sure that FTEs are prorated to the second decimal, for example, 1.00. If you see an FTE above 0.50, verify with the subgrantee that they prorated their FTEs to reflect only what was SASP grant funded. we do have a calculating cheat sheet for how to calculate FTEs. This is based on the 52 weeks in the year, which equates to 2,080 working hours in a 12-month period for a full-time employee who works 40 hours a week. So for example, one FTE equals somebody who was 100% SASP grant funded to work 40 hours a week for the entire calendar year. For this reason, we often do not see high FTEs because SASP grant funds often partially support grant-funded activity or grant-funded staff time. If you have any questions about calculating FTEs with your grantees or your subgrantees, please feel free to reach out to VAWA MEI at any time. We are happy to help calculate FTEs. There are ways to translate money spent on stipends and on-call staff into FTEs. The money spent on stipends for advocates, for example, should be translated into an FTE by estimating an average of what a full-time advocate is paid for in an annual salary in the subgrantee's state or area. And then you can use this to base your estimate for the FTE about what was paid out in stipends. For example, if an average salary in the subgrantee's coverage area is about $20,000 a year for a full-time advocate, and the grantee spent $10,000 in stipends, you could translate this into a 0.5 FTE. Details on how FTEs are calculated in this case should be detailed in the last question on the form, question 24. It's important to review the subgrantee's goals and objectives to determine if the subgrantee prorated staff FTEs appropriately. For example, if the subgrantee is reporting a full-time advocate, but only half the advocate's salary is paid for by SASP funds, that position should be prorated. There is another example on this slide for how to prorate or estimate an FTE value. We do want to emphasize that there is a difference between outreach to victims and direct victim advocacy. The majority of SASP-funded staff time is most likely going to be in victim advocacy, but if you have subgrantees conducting targeted outreach activities to try to let programs or survivors know about their services, that does count as staff time that you can report as outreach here. We do believe that high numbers in outreach FTE might be a red flag that FTEs are not being prorated or are possibly not being reported by job function rather than job title. As you can see from this slide, outreach work encompasses outreach to victims and survivors regarding services offered by the SASP-funded program, and outreach to other community agencies regarding services offered by the SASP-funded program. Victim advocate work, however, encompasses assisting a victim or survivor in accessing needed resources or services and providing crisis intervention, safety planning, and support during medical exams. There are, of course, other examples of what would fall into these two categories, but as a general rule of thumb, we do want to encourage subgrantees to make that distinction. Another thing to be on the lookout for when you review SASP subgrantee forms is if the subgrantee reported in the other category. If the subgrantee contracts with another agency for a fixed period of time, for example, to do the work of someone who was on maternity leave perhaps, even though that person may technically be a contractor, that is not what we want to see reported in the other category because it's not very specific. So we're hoping that we don't see words like contractor, temporary employee, vendors in the other category. have the subgrantees report them by the functions that they are performing that are grant funded. In more than one, and if more than one staff is reported in the other category, make sure that there's a distinction about how many FTEs are associated with each different staff. That might be done in a narrative question, but you definitely want to look for that kind of detail when you're reviewing SASP subgrantee reports. Also note that we rarely see, there are a few instances where we see appropriate responses in the other category because the staff categories are fairly broad and might encompass multiple different types of staff functions. So if you see something reported in a subgrantee report in the other category, try to look for a best fit category that already exists that the subgrantee should be using. So for example, if you see hotline advocate in the other category, that should be reported as a victim advocate. If you see court advocate in the other category, that should be reported in the legal advocate category. Also note that as a resource, there is a guide to staff others available on our website. That might be used to help you review what's in the other category, and it might be used to direct your subgrantees on how to appropriately report on staff who might not fit as best as they can into an existing category. Next is Section B, Statutory Purpose Areas. In Question 9, the subgrantee will check off all purpose areas that apply to the subgrantee in the current reporting period. None of these should be a surprise to you when you're reviewing your subgrantee form. If they are, you might want to check back with your subgrantee to make sure that they know what they are supposed to be using their grant funds for, and just to be on the same page as them. Next is Section C, Informational Materials. If SASP program funds were used to develop, substantially revise, or distribute informational materials during the reporting period, the subgrantee will be completing this section. Also note that substantially revised means that significant time was spent on revising an existing product. So if only one word changed, that probably does not need to be reported here because that wouldn't exactly fall into the category of substantially revised. For example, during the current reporting period, if the subgrantee developed one brochure with subgrant funds or subgrant funded staff and had 1,000 copies made, the subgrantee would only report one in the first column of number developed or revised. So look for very high numbers in that first column because that indicates a misunderstanding. The number printed should not be reported in the number developed or revised column. For example, if you see that they listed 500 brochures in that first column, that likely indicates that that's how many copies they had made. Not that they created 500 separate brochures during the current reporting period. They could report or should report the number of those brochures that were used and distributed during the current reporting period. But again, this is not the number printed. It's how many were used or distributed. So maybe they printed 500 copies of their brand new brochure and only distributed 200 of them. They will report that number of 200 distributed in that fourth column. Also note that that last column, other languages, we're looking for a specific language, not the number of languages, other than English. So if it was only developed in English, they don't need to add that there. If it was developed in 7 languages, we don't want to see the number 7. We're looking for what 7 specific languages that product was developed. If the subgrantee developed a product during the current reporting period, but the subgrantee did not distribute the product during the current reporting period, the subgrantee would report a 1 in that first column, number developed or revised, but they would report a 0 in the number of used or distributed. The subgrantee does not have to report that they are planning to distribute 100 copies during the next reporting period. Similarly, if the subgrantee developed a product in a previous reporting period and the subgrant funds were used to distribute that product during the current reporting period, the subgrantee will not report it as developed in the first column. They would, however, report the title and topic, intended audience, and how many were used or distributed in other languages for the current reporting period. The OVW program manager will pay attention to this as they use this section to monitor the products subgrantees are supporting with grant funds. Next is Section D, Victim Services. All SASP subgrantees must complete this section. Most of the data in this Victim Services section is congressionally mandated. Congress wants to know how many of the number of victims and survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. We do have some tips for reviewing the Victim Services section as a SASP administrator. Victim services provided by volunteers should be prorated if they are supervised or coordinated by SASP-funded staff. So if you know that that's happening at one of your subgrantee agencies, make sure to look for that being reported in the Victim Services section. Subgrantees should not report FTEs for volunteers, but they should report their SASP-funded activities. Additionally, you want to be on the lookout for agency-wide totals here. Like I've mentioned before in this recording, we often see that SASP grant funds partially support certain services or staff members, and that means that we only want to prorate down and report the percentage or number that was supported by SASP grant funds, not agency-wide totals. When your subgrantees are considering what to report in this section, they should consider what services the victims and survivors request or accept, what services are funded by their grant, and if the victim or survivor is a primary victim of sexual assault. So there are some definitions that we like to hand out for served, partially served, and not served. Keeping in mind what I mentioned on the previous slide, all victims and survivors who are considered served received all of the grant-funded services that they requested during the current reporting period. Anyone reported as partially served received some, but not all, of the grant-funded services that they requested during the current reporting period. Not served indicates that the victim or survivor did not receive any of the requested services that the agency is SASP funded to provide. There are victims that are not reported on this form. Not reported on this form are victims and survivors who request services that are not funded by the SASP grant, and victims who refuse to accept SASP-funded services that were offered. In question 12, subgrantees may report the number of secondary victims that were served. Secondary victims include children, siblings, spouses, relatives, anyone who is indirectly affected by sexual assault. If they are reported in question 12, those people must have received services, but do not necessarily need to be tied to a primary victim or survivor who was reported in question 11. An example of this might be someone who came in as a secondary victim requesting services, even though the primary victim that they are in connection with is not receiving services from the SASP-funded agency. In question 13, your subgrantees will check off any reasons for why victims and survivors were not fully served. And in question 14, we get into the demographics of anyone who was reported as fully served or partially served. When you are checking subgrantee reports, make sure that the race and ethnicity total is equal to or greater than the sum of people reported as fully and partially served in question 11. We say equal to or greater than because some people may choose to identify as multiple race ethnicity categories, and that is extremely acceptable. So as long as it is not lower than the number of people who received services, then that's great. The gender and age totals must equal exactly the number of people who were reported as served and partially served in question 11. Just as a note, subgrantees should collect this demographic data to the best of their ability. There will be cases in which collecting this data will create a barrier to service for a victim or could violate client confidentiality. The victim's safety and well-being should always be the primary consideration. If subgrantees are not able to obtain demographic information for a victim, they should report that victim in the unknown categories in question 14. Subgrantees report demographic information for primary victims and survivors only, not for secondary victims. In the age category, ages 0 through 6 and 7 through 12 are for those who are victims and survivors of sexual assault, including child sexual assault, in a dating relationship. It should not be used to count children of victims. For these other demographic categories, subgrantees will report the number of people with disabilities, people who are immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, only to the extent that the subgrantees have learned of those specific demographic information through providing services. Subgrantees should not include questions about persons' disabilities or immigration status on any forms used to serve the victims or survivors as a means for collecting this information. It is not required information and does not have to be filled out if that information is not inherently already gathered. We're going to skip over a couple of questions that are fairly straightforward, so we don't typically see any errors in. As a quick note for question 16, we are looking for the total number of unique victims and survivors who received each service category. So it's not a count of how many times victims and survivors received those services. It's how many unique victims and survivors received the service type during the reporting period. Question 17, hotline calls, information, and referral, is one where we often see errors. OVW asks that subgrantees only report grant-funded activities. The subgrantee should report all hotline calls handled by the grant-funded staff and or the volunteers that they supervise. Or the subgrantee should prorate their agency's total hotline calls to reflect what portion or percentage of hotline calls that were supported by grant funds. This is not a place where we typically see appropriate agency-wide totals. If you see extremely large numbers here, please check with your subgrantee to see that they are adhering to OVW's request that this only be reported of grant-funded activities. If grant-funded staff are answering the hotline or supervising volunteers who answer the hotline, the subgrantee will report all hotline calls handled by grant-funded staff and or volunteers that they supervise. If grant funds are a supporting a portion of the hotline budget, the subgrantee needs to prorate their agency's total hotline calls to only reflect what percentage of the budget is supported by the SASP subgrant. In question 18, outreach, many subgrantees incorrectly report agency-wide totals here. If you see extremely large numbers here, please check that the subgrantee is again adhering to OVW's request that subgrantees only report on grant-funded activities. Subgrantees should only report on grant-funded, unsolicited outreach activities in question 18. If 100% of the unsolicited outreach activities are funded by the SASP Formula grant, then the subgrantee should report the agency's total of outreach letters or whatever method of unsolicited outreach activities they are using. If the SASP Formula grant funds make up a piece of the subgrantee's budget for unsolicited outreach activities, then the subgrantee should again only report the percentage of the agency's total number out of outreach letters or activities that is supported by the SASP Formula grant funds. Here's an example of prorating outreach activities to report only what is grant funded. For example, a full-time outreach advocate might be 50% SASP Formula grant funded. This outreach advocate may be mailed 1,000 unsolicited letters offering information in support of services during the current reporting period. Because this advocate is only 50% grant funded, the subgrantee should prorate the total number of unsolicited outreach activities that staff person conducted to 50%. So in this example, you would have 50% of the FTE, or 0.5, as an outreach advocate, and then for question 18, you would report half, or 50%, of their activities that were unsolicited outreach. So in this example, it would be 500 instead of the full 1,000 that were done, because we're prorating to reflect only what was SASP Formula grant funded. Next is section E, the narrative section of the subgrantee reporting form. All subgrantees must answer questions 21 and 22. For question 21, check that a subgrantee identified significant areas of remaining need with regard to improving services to victims and survivors of sexual assault, increasing victim-survivor safety, and enhancing community response. This includes offender accountability for sex offenders. Grantees might also consider writing about geographic regions, underserved populations, service delivery systems, and challenges or barriers unique to their jurisdiction. For question 22, check a subgrantee form to see that the subgrantee has written about what SASP Formula grant funds have enabled their agency to do that they could not do prior to receiving this funding. For example, a subgrantee could write about expanding services to include criminal justice advocacy or expanding coordination and cross-referrals with sexual assault agencies in their community. If subgrantees have any information about what it was like before receiving SASP Formula program funding that they can compare with results that have occurred after receiving SASP Formula program funding, OVW would really like to hear about those impacts. VAWA MEI can use stories and statistics that subgrantees provide when we write our reports to OVW, so definitely encourage your subgrantees to write very specific examples in questions 21 and 22. For question 23, subgrantees are asked to provide additional information regarding the effectiveness of their SASP grant-funded program. This is also a spot that subgrantees might write about data or information that they did not already report in an answer to a previous question that might demonstrate the effectiveness of their SASP-funded program. This narrative question occasionally indicates reporting difficulties or misunderstanding. So please, as SASP administrators reviewing the subgrantee reports, do follow up with subgrantees if you notice anything in the narrative that suggests the subgrantees need assistance with the reporting form. For question 24, subgrantees are asked to provide any additional information that they would like OVW or VAWA MEI to know about the data that they're submitting. If there are any issues or irregularities with the data in the subgrantee report, the subgrantees are asked to provide explanations here that will help entities reviewing their data understand the data in question. For example, if a subgrantee's computer crashed and they lost all of their data, or if a person that a subgrantee hired left during the current reporting period that inhibits them from reporting on certain statistics, hopefully a subgrantee indicates that kind of information in this narrative question. We here at VAWA MEI look at this question before we look anywhere else on any part of the subgrantee report. This narrative question occasionally indicates reporting difficulties and misunderstandings, so please, as SASP administrators reviewing the subgrantee report, do follow up with your subgrantees if you notice anything in the narrative questions that suggests the subgrantee might need assistance with the reporting form, or if they need additional assistance with how to go about collecting their data. Here on the left of the screen is a list of different resources that you might suggest your subgrantees access or that you might access as administrators. There is a closed captioning recording for the SASP administrators on our website, vawamei.org. You can send subgrantees the link to watch a recording about filling out the SASP subgrantee reporting form. You can suggest that they access the helpful hints for SASP administrators form, or you might choose to review that also when reviewing subgrantee reports. You can review the quick guide for reviewing subgrantee reports. There's a downloadable guide to staff categories and a guide to victim services categories. There is also a way to access a corrections form if you hear from VAWA MEI at any point about possible discrepancies on subgrantee forms. So feel free to also download that if you are asked to edit a victim services section. And there's also information on our website that will enable you to contact us for any additional help or technical assistance that you might need. Thank you so much for accessing our recording today. Here's some contact information for the VAWA MEI main line and main email. There's also information here about how to reach your program specialist at OVW. And if you or your subgrantees are experiencing any GMS issues, please contact the GMS support line or the email and encourage them to be persistent with contacting GMS. Thank you so much. Good luck with your reporting.